Hello and welcome to Study Buzz. Today I'm going to discuss a short story written by Jhumpa Lahiri, and the name of the short story is Interpreter of Maldives. Interpreter of Maldives is a short story written by American author Jhumpa Lahiri. It was published in 1999 as a part of collection of stories of the same name. That means it's a part of collection that has the same title, Interpreter of Maldives. The 9 stories of the collection revolve around Indians and Indian Americans, reflecting their attempts to bridge the gap between the two cultures. Interpreter of Maldives won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. It was also selected as the New Yorker's Best Debut of the Year. It also won the Hemingway Pen Award in 2000. It was also a commercial success because of its endorsement by Oprah Winfrey. Now, summary of the story. Mr. and Mrs. Das with their 3 kids are on vacation in India and they are going to visit Sun Temple. They hired Mr. Kapasi, an Indian tour guide, to drive them to temple. The family sits in the car which is stopped near a tea stall. Mr. and Mrs. Das are arguing about who should take their daughter Tina to the bathroom. Mrs. Das finally takes her to the bathroom while Mr. Das is left in the car with his sons. Ronnie, who closely resembles his father, Mr. Das, looks at a goat and he says he wants to give the goat a piece of gum. Mr. Das reprimands him but does nothing to stop him. Mr. Das tells Bobby, the younger son, to go look after Ronnie. When Bobby refuses, Mr. Das does nothing to enforce his order. In conversation, Mr. Das tells Mr. Kapasi that both he and his wife were born and raised in the United States. Mr. Das also reveals that their parents now live in India and that the Das family visits them every few years. When Tina comes back to the car, Mr. Das asks Tina where her mother is. Mr. Kapasi notices that Mr. Das uses his wife's first name, and he thinks it is an unusual way to speak to a child. While Mrs. Das buys some puffed rice from a nearby vendor, Mr. Das tells Mr. Kapasi that he is a middle school teacher in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Mr. Kapasi reveals that he has been a tour guide for 5 years. During the ride, Tina plays with the locks in the back of the car and Mrs. Das does not stop her. Mrs. Das sits in the car silently and eats her snack without offering any to anyone else. Children get excited when they see monkeys, which Mr. Kapasi says are common in the area. Mr. Das asks him to stop the car so that he can take a picture of a starving peasant. Mrs. Das paints her fingernails and dismisses Tina's request when she insists on having her nails done too. She then complains to her husband for not getting an air-conditioned car. Mr. Kapasi observes that Mr. and Mrs. Das are more like siblings to their children than parents. When asked, Mr. Kapasi says that being a tour guide is not boring, as he works in a doctor's office the rest of the week. He works as an interpreter, translating the Gujarati spoken by patients. Mrs. Das says that his job is romantic and asks him to tell her about some of his patients. However, Mr. Kapasi views his job as a failure. Before his marriage, he dreamed of being an interpreter of diplomats, as he was so skilled with languages. When his son contracted typhoid at the age of 7, he met the doctor and started his job as payment for the boy's treatment. The boy died, but Mr. Kapasi kept the job because the pay was better than his previous teaching job. But his wife does not like the job because it reminds her of their son's death. Mr. Kapasi's marriage was arranged by his parents, and he and his wife have nothing in common. Mr. Kapasi seduces by Mrs. Das' description of his job as romantic, and he begins fantasizing about Mrs. Das. When they stop for lunch, Mrs. Das insists that Mr. Kapasi sit with them. He does, and Mr. Das takes their picture together. Mrs. Das gets Mr. Kapasi's address so that she can send him a copy of the picture, and Mr. Kapasi begins to daydream about how they will have a great correspondence that will, in a way, finally fulfill his dreams of being a diplomat between countries. He imagines the witty things he will write to her and how she will reveal the unhappiness of her marriage. At the temple, Mrs. Das talks with Mr. Kapasi as they stare at erotic poses of women in the temple. Mr. Kapasi admires her legs and continues to dream about their letters. While taking them back to their hotel, Mr. Kapasi suggests that they should go to see a nearby monastery, and they agree. When they arrive, the place is swarming with monkeys. Mr. Kapasi tells them that the monkeys are not dangerous as long as they are not fed. Mrs. Das refuses to go out with Mr. Das and kids because she feels tired. She sits in the front seat next to Mr. Kapasi and tells him that the younger son, Bobby, is not son of Mr. Das. He is the product of an affair she had 8 years ago. She slept with a friend of Mr. Das who came to visit while she was a lonely housewife, and she has never told anyone about it. She tells Mr. Kapasi because he is an interpreter of Maldives, and she believes he can help her. Mr. Kapasi's feelings for her soon begins to evaporate. Mrs. Das reveals that she no longer loves her husband, whom she has known since she was a young child, and that she has destructive impulses towards her life and her children. She asks Mr. Kapasi to suggest some remedy for her pain. Mr. Kapasi asks if it is pain she feels or guilt. Insulted, Mrs. Das gets out of the car and joins her family. As she walks, she drops a trail of puffed rice. Meanwhile, the children and Mr. Das have been playing with the monkeys. Mrs. Das goes to join them. She observes that Bobby is missing. They find him surrounded by monkeys because of Mrs. Das' puffed rice and are hitting Bobby on the legs with a stick he had given to them. Mr. Das accidentally takes a picture in his nervousness, and Mrs. Das screams for Mr. Kapasi to do something. Mr. Kapasi comes to rescue and chases off the monkeys. He carries Bobby back to his family. Mrs. Das puts a bandage on Bobby's knee. Then she reaches into her bandage to get a hairbrush to straighten his hair, and the paper with Mr. Kapasi's address on it flutters away. So this is the summary of the story. Now, analysis. Interpreter of Maladies is told from third person limited point of view. That means it is told from only Mr. Kapasi's point of view. Important characters are Mr. Das, in the story by his wife, sometimes he is called as Raj. Mrs. Das, by her husband Mr. Das, she was called as Meena. Mr. Kapasi and the 3 kids, Ronnie, Bobby and Tina. What are the important themes of the story? Language and communication, love and marriage, family, inner dissatisfaction, dreams, hopes, and plans, cultural clash, and identity. I hope this story is clear to you. Thanks for watching.